We're currently in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle leaving the city of Sumy and heading towards the Russian border, where we're expected to get an exclusive first-hand glance into the city of Sumy, which the Ukrainians recently captured. The closer you get to the Russian border, the more you see that's destroyed houses, hotels, residential buildings. When I came here previously with a group of soldiers, they told me that it's not artillery or drones that are doing the work here. It's mainly the massive Russian glide bombs that they can launch from well over the border. We just crossed the border into the official territory of the Russian Federation. Now, it's believed the Ukrainians control more than 1,000 square kilometers here and are digging in to prepare for possible Russian counter-offensives in the region. However, the offensive may still expand and more Russian land may fall into Ukrainian hands soon enough. They've ordered us, along with all the other reporters and civilians, into this bunker right here because they've seen an FPV drone and they're worried that the Russians could see us and hit it with something.
Зараз отримали сигнал, що на місто насувається група ударних безпілотних літальних апаратів і півдронів. Тож ми змушені спуститися в бомбосховище, щоб перечекати.
We've been down here for maybe 15-20 minutes now, which is quite a while. We were expecting to be in and out, but the soldiers are still quite worried about whatever's flying overhead from us. They've been burned with the experiences of these drones, especially in Donbass, where they're absolutely omnipresent in the skies.
Я прошу прощения, я случайно. Я бы даже на здоровую наступал.
The Russians are a bit worried because they've seen an FPV drone in the air and that can often be used to correct or spot artillery fire. This is not an uncommon thing in the battlefields in Ukraine and now Russia.
So Russians use a variety of reconnaissance drones. They can spot like movement of soldiers or vehicles or anything basically from 5, 6, 7 kilometers. Once they are flying and and observing what's going on, and once they observe something, then of course the other units like artillery, drones, any other units, they see the feed from the drone in real time. They correct fire. They make decision basically what to use against which number or like how important is the target. So and based on that what can reach the target, is it artillery, is it FPV drone, if it's something closer, if it's something more like long distance stuff, they just send that and attack, and they know they see in real time where the incoming is happening, where explosion happens, so they can correct and adjust to make sure the target is hit. So that's why the drones, if the drones spot us, it is very, very dangerous, because then they know where we are, they can follow us, and once we stop, once we are stationary, they can, anything can happen.
I understand.
The sign in the background says Mirny Ludi, which means peaceful people, basically. It's because we're actually at a humanitarian aid shelter for Russian civilians who, they seem to have everything they need, but they look very stressed, they look very tired, they look very sad. They're mostly elderly people who often do not want to move. A lot of others have been evacuated to the city of Kursk or the wider region as the Ukrainian army continues pushing into the area.
Victor, that's a good picture here.
We were in their basement for more than an hour, but they have finally given us the green light to jump in and leave, and we're going to be heading back to Sumy and Ukrainian territory as soon as possible.
Continuing to try and stop the Russians in the east hasn't been working. The Russians are making very small advances. It's costing them huge numbers of personnel and equipment. Over 1,000 troops a day being killed or injured, such that they have to be taken off the battlefield. But the Russians are making some small advances. Therefore, to try and dislocate the Russians, to try and get the initiative back, which the Ukrainians have done with their Kursk incursion, they've taken this bold decision. Now, it's not something they'll have planned lightly. It's not something they'll have planned at the spur of the moment, something that will have been very carefully planned and worked through. And I remember saying only last week or the week before on Times Radio that I thought the Kursk incursion was phase one of more to come from Ukraine. This Belgorod could be the next phase.
Do you think we can draw any parallels from what we saw with the Kursk incursion and potentially how Ukraine might advance with this incursion now?
Well, I think what seems to be happening, and I'm speculating a little here with the lack of information, is that the Ukrainians are going to try and take over a sort of buffer zone inside Russia along its northern border. That will probably equate in a similar size to the amount of territory that the Russians are holding in the east of Ukraine. So that's an interesting maneuver, and that could be what Zelensky's end game is with this, to turn around and say, you've got some of my stuff, I've got some of your stuff. We either agree to keep what we've got, or we agree to give it back again. So it's a very bold move. It's a risky move, but I think very well planned, and it's certainly causing Putin a real headache.
With the Kursk incursion, it was notable how slow Russia was to respond to it. Do you think that perhaps Russia could make the same mistake twice? Are we seeing any evidence of how they are reacting so far?
Well, we're not seeing any evidence. It's very early days with what's going on in Belgorod, and this could be just another raid to dislocate Russian thinking. But and given the fact that Ukrainians attacked into Belgorod twice in the last year, the Russians should be more prepared for an attack into there. If the Ukrainians make significant advances, it shows that the Russians are in a much worse state than we'd even thought beforehand, and I'd even thought a week ago. But it's early days to say exactly what's going to happen. I'll be watching this very closely.
I mean, what would be your analysis of the situation in Kursk at the moment? They've got around 500 square miles of territory. Do we see any advancements there, or do we think that Ukraine's going to start putting their effort into this second incursion?
Well, the Ukrainians have made significant advances in Kursk. They seem to have slowed down over the last couple of days, but that's probably because they're reaching what we call the limit of exploitation, the limit of without thinning out their combat troops too much, without extending the logistic lines of supply too much. And they're putting effort into securing what they've got. And we're seeing this greater control over this same river. That will allow the Ukrainians to trap, and by dropping the bridges across it, they have trapped quite a large number of Russians to the south of that. And by stopping the Russians putting temporary bridging across, they're stopping the reinforcement and they're stopping them from withdrawing. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see the Ukrainians pushing out to the west inside the Kursk region a little bit more, capturing all that area to the south of the river, expanding what they've got enormously at minimal cost. The Belgorod could either be a distraction for that or them deciding to push further out to the east. This is significant, and I think another masterstroke by the Ukrainians.
Ukraine has to find innovative ways to fight the battle, and that's what they're doing with this incursion. It's militarily, it doesn't actually make a great deal of sense because you're diverting troops away from the main effort. Why would you do that? Politically, it plays to the center of gravity of President Putin. Centers of gravity being things that the one of the combatants just doesn't want to lose. And if Putin knows he's actually put in power by the oligarchs, the power base, if they think there's any chance of this war being lost, they are not currently able to holiday in Paris. They're not able to go across to London. There's all sorts of sanctions crippling their business, and Putin is now indicted by the International Criminal Court. The more that Zelensky can demonstrate to normal Russians that they're in a war, that this isn't just some foreign foray, that actually they are directly being affected, whether it's their young men predominantly and women being returned in boxes or without limbs, whether it's people being evacuated from the Kursk region, 150,000 people, they're going to talk as well. And all the sanctions, I think it all starts to pile up and potentially erode support for Putin.
Well, let's pick up on that. How would you assess the strength of his position domestically currently?
It's a very, very good question, James, and I'm impossibly ill-equipped to answer that. I think what we have seen in history is that dictatorial leaders get very, very swiftly replaced. It doesn't end well generally for dictatorial leaders. I think we saw with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who rode a tide, it felt, of public opinion that managed to get him further to Moscow than many would have expected. Putin will be worried about that. It's very difficult when Putin controls all the information, and largely for domestic Russians, it's a bit like in this country, you might have strong political views, but frankly, as long as it doesn't affect what you do each day, you get up, look after your kids, go down the pub, you don't really mind who's in power. Likewise in Russia, they'll believe whatever they're fed as long as they can get on with their lives, bring up their families in some sort of security. But over time, gradually, the narrative that Putin's coming out with does not connect with the number of people coming back in body bags that they're having to bury. Everybody will know somebody in a body bag. By way of context, in the Afghanistan war in the UK, only a few hundred were killed, several thousand were badly injured. But Help for Heroes created a huge bow wave across the country of sympathy for our servicemen and women. Just imagine multiplying that by 100, maybe 1,000. That's the impact this is having in domestic Russia. So all of this is gradually nibbling away at Putin's power base. When will it crumble? Who knows? But history shows these are often short, sharp shocks rather than through a process of osmosis. But they managed to roll back the Russian defenses pretty quickly. So they capitalized. It now looks likely they have 10,000 troops in that little enclave. It looks like they've blown 3 bridges. If they were planning to go any further, they wouldn't have blown those bridges. So it looks likely they're settling in and digging themselves in. The real surprise is why President Putin doesn't appear to have done anything about it. I think when we discussed before, one of the options was Putin, because he's Mr. Security, he would need to be seen to be dealing with this incursion firmly. I mean, let's be blunt. It's the first time that Russia's been invaded since 1941. So for a man who presents himself as Mr. Security, this is deeply humiliating. So the question is, why has he not reacted so far? And I think what's been interesting, a couple of answers to that. One of them, I come from military where we delegate down. So from our junior non-commissioned ranks, our corporals, our senior non-commissioned ranks, our sergeants, they are empowered to take control in a world of ambiguity. They understand commander's intent. When things happen that are a surprise, they get on and do something about it. Whereas in the Russian military, that's not the way they operate. Any surprises, they look to their boss and say, what do I do now, boss? Their bosses look to their bosses, and it cascades all the way up, in this case, almost certainly to President Putin. And that leads to a sort of strategic paralysis on the front line until the boss, President Putin, decides what to do. I still think there are two options, one of which is to crush the Ukrainians that are there. And that would take battle-hardened troops. Russia would have to move them from the front line. That would ease pressure on the front line, and that's exactly what Ukraine is probably hoping it'll do. The other option, which I think is playing out at the moment, is Russia has fixed 10,000 of Ukraine's best fighters in a portion of Russia. He doesn't have to do anything about it now. He can put a ring of steel around it, deal with that another day. Meanwhile, as a military guy, you're always focused on main effort. And what appears to be Russia's main effort is the special military operation, seize Crimea, the land bridge, and the Donbass. He's done most of that. There's a small area of the Donbass, relatively small, he hasn't yet taken. It looks like Putin is doubling down on that. Pokrovsk, Toretsk are the two areas of focus. And that means he's got 10 to 12 weeks this summer before the winter settles in. It becomes much more difficult to fight. And that's what appears to be what Putin is doing at the moment.
And it's interesting as well, he's got his mate Lukashenko in Belarus to assemble some troops on the border with Ukraine in Gomel Oblast of Belarus. So again, that's probably designed to try and divert some Ukrainian troops up there as well?
It could be. I have to say, having been watching this closely for the full scale of the war, you'll recall early on in the war, Russia had positioned troops in Belarus, and there were suggestions that they'd be mounting attacks out of Belarus. And actually using the Belarusian soldiers as part of that attack. The trouble is, Lukashenko is known as the last dictator in Europe. And it was pretty clear at the time that the Belarusian military said, this is not our war. We're not going to follow you in there. And if you do, that would cause all sorts of unrest and potentially lead to the end of Lukashenko. So I suspect Ukraine has discounted that as a serious threat. What Lukashenko is probably trying to do is he wants to be a buddy to President Putin. He wants to demonstrate that he's doing all he can by putting troops at the border. It just puts a little bubble of doubt in President Zelensky's mind. He's probably got to do something with his resources just to cover off that risk, even though it's very unlikely those troops would actually come in.
Do you think, Sean, we will see at some point further cross-border raids by Ukraine into Russia?
I think it's inevitable. I do think that, in fact, I'd be quite surprised if they're not happening already. There's been some articles appeared over the last 48 hours about special operations executives, the name that was given in World War II to areas that were occupied where, resistance fighters operated both within Ukraine, occupied Ukraine, and also in Russia. I suspect there's a continued theme here of making life as unpleasant as possible for Russia. And of course, once Russia realizes that it can't protect its borders, that has strategic. The number one priority of any political master is to protect your people. If you can't do that, real questions start to get asked. Why are we in Ukraine? All of a sudden, more and more people are talking, more and more dissent. That is very difficult for Putin to manage. We're not there yet. I'm not suggesting there's going to be a big coup, but I am suggesting it's just consistently undermining President Putin's position. And that'll be something that I suspect President Zelensky will be doing all he can. It's an asymmetric tactic. It plays to his strengths. I suspect we're going to see more of it.
Even before the war, he was getting increasingly isolated. And I guess it all started with COVID, when he famously self-isolated himself in the Kremlin. And sort of 2 years into the pandemic, he wouldn't shake people's hands. He would only meet someone if they themselves had self-isolated for 2 weeks, or if they've been religiously tested for COVID. So it started with that his circle got very, very close. And apart from children of his allies or his own relatives, we've also seen him elevating people who are not just close to him family-wise, but sort of have been close to his physical body, including bodyguards. For example, there was this recent appointment of a former bodyguard who was a governor just outside Moscow, and he was recently promoted to sort of spearhead the efforts to drive the Ukrainian army from Kursk, which obviously is a very sensitive issue, because this is the first time We have foreign forces on Russian soil since the end of the Second World War. And yeah, you can see that this is a very sensitive task, and he would obviously want to entrust it with someone who he has a lot of trust with, including this deputy. Duman is the name. And not just the incursion of Kursk, but the Wagner mutiny, the mutiny of his former warlord and confidant, to whom he previously outsourced a lot of war in Ukraine, even before the full scale of invasion. He definitely saw it as a betrayal of someone he trusted a lot. So what we're seeing, we're just seeing sort of like recycling of the same people. We're not seeing much of a new blood. For example, if we go back to the defense ministry, the person who succeeded his long-term ally, former Minister Sergei Shoigu, is someone from is a former economic advisor who's been working for him for a long time. So it's sort of about recycling the same old cadre of people all over again, just plucking them from one seat and putting them into another. It pains me to say that, but right now Belarus is not a fully independent country, as we've been seeing since 2020, when the Kremlin threw its weight behind Alexander Lukashenko and basically helped him to secure a re-election in Belarus, despite overwhelming nationwide protests which were about to topple him. Belarus sort of became a vassal of Russia. We see that. There's nothing going on in Belarus without the Kremlin's explicit or implicit orders. And as we saw at the start of the invasion, Belarus served as a springboard for the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. This is how Russian troops were able to get closer to Kiev, because they were pouring in from the north, from the northern Ukrainian border, from Belarus. And this is where they've been seeing troops amassing again. It started with the Belarusian president telling Ukraine off for amassing troops on its side of the border. So Lukashenko is now playing the victim and saying that, there's a threat to our border, so we're going to move troops closer to that. I would say this is not surprising, considering the ongoing Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. Belarus is a Russian puppet as we know it, and this is definitely some sort of a threat that Russia is brandishing out there, sort of showing to Kiev that if we wanted to invade the Kiev region again, if we wanted to get somewhat close to Kiev again, we will do it. Because for most of the war, I would say, after Russian forces pulled back from the Kiev region in spring 2022, there was hardly any threat to Ukraine from the Belarusian border. So with this, Russia is basically showing to Ukraine that, we could start doing it again, and you're going to have another front, unless you pull back from Kursk, or unless you step down and whatever you say. We have seen stories of defections in the Russian forces, not a lot of them to Ukraine. There was this daring escape of a fighter jet pilot who famously hijacked his plane into Ukraine, I believe, in 2023. This one is a member of paratroopers, if I'm not mistaken. He apparently coordinated his defection with Ukrainian forces, so he knew where he was going after that and where he was what he was doing. He filmed himself throwing a grenade into the barracks he was stationed at. I believe it was a basement of some sort. So there's quite an extraordinary video making rounds, a video that shows an explosion of that grenade thrown into the quarters of his commanders. After that, he apparently was able to cross the border into Ukraine. The Ukrainian officials were able to coordinate an escape route with him, and he resurfaced in Kiev last week and gave a press conference and said that he was very much disillusioned. He's not a conscript. He's a professional soldier. He's someone who's been serving in an army for a while, and as he says, that he didn't go to the army to do just that. He went, he joined the armed forces to defend his country from someone. And as he saw, the Russian army was actually attacking in another country, and this is not something he signed up for. So he was able to defect. I would say my main concern here is his own personal safety, because as some of our readers might remember, that Russian pilot who hijacked the plane into Ukraine, his case was very much publicized in Ukraine and abroad. He was offered an asylum in Spain after that, and a couple of months later, he was found dead in a Spanish home. So definitely, there's, I would have a lot of security concerns for that man, because it looks like Russia would be targeting those people. And as we know, Vladimir Putin, he has a thing about treason and traitors. So for him, in a way, this is this cardinal sin, and he would like to see the government to go after those people to show an example that these are the consequences for you if you decide to do that. Look, I mean, defections are happening. They're just not that publicized. And if I were a Russian soldier, I would rather want to do it quietly away from the camera, so that I wouldn't repeat the fate of that Russian pilot who ended up killed in Spain. There's this one Russian charity that has actually been helping Russian soldiers to defect from all over the country, and they are using very creative routes. Some of them lead to Baltic states across northwestern Russia, so it's not that straightforward. Those defections are few. I think we were talking about dozens. I would say a couple of dozens a month from what I've been hearing. But it's been happening, and I would say one of the concerns is communications, because the Russian state is trying to make an example of the defectors that it catches. There's a lot of news going around in Russian media about Russian police catching men who are trying to join the Ukrainian army, who are trying to join Russian fighters fighting alongside Ukraine. And those people are getting caught. They are filmed, they are put on trial, and all of those trials are highly publicized, explicitly with the aim to ward off those defections as much as they can.